Harriet Loveday, The Adventure of the Christmas Cracker and Other Short Stories. Story 7, The Other Side of the Christmas Train Tracks. 3 boys stood on the bridge over the railway line, waiting for the Christmas special steam train to pass by underneath. There was supposed to be a Santa on board. Not that there'd ever been, or that they believed in Santa anymore. They were too grown up for that. The boys were aged 7, 9 and 12. You could tell they were brothers, not just because they looked a little similar, the same auburn hair, pale skin and hazel eyes as their mum, but because they had the same short home hairdresser haircuts, the same polyester padded winter jackets, just in 3 different sizes, and the same mannerisms. The road crossing the bridge over the railway was only lightly used by traffic, but that didn't stop the boys punching each other in play fights across the road and scuffling with each other as they waited for the train to pass by underneath. John, the youngest, loved trains. He'd begged his elder brother, Michael, to bring him. Paul, his middle brother, was fairly easygoing and didn't mind. Michael felt some responsibility as the eldest to accommodate John's wishes, so they'd all gone. Sometimes, when John was upset or feeling out of sorts, his mum would console him with, "Oh, one day we'll take a trip on the steam train, eh?" But they never did. There was never enough spare money. It was okay. He understood that the essentials like the electricity bill and the food came before luxuries like riding on steam trains. But still, he didn't tell his elder brothers, but when they went to sleep at night in their shared bedroom, he would often imagine, as he lay there waiting for sleep, what it would be like to ride on the train. John would stand on the platform with his mum and brothers. There would be an old man with a large tummy, looking a little like the Fat Controller, although he knew Thomas the Tank Engine was for babies, so not very like him. Another man in a blue suit and matching cap would usher them on board, and they would sit around a table by a window. As it was just the 4 of them, they'd all fit, just as if it was made for them. Then the whistle would sound, the engine would puff, the wheels would creak and the carriages would jerk as the train slowly started to move out of the station and smoke issued from the train's funnel. Chuff, chuff, gathering speed the wheels would turn. Chuff, 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 from the engine the fire would burn. Chuff, 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 faster and faster along the track. Woo, woo. John came back to now. His brothers had been collecting pine cones to throw at the train when it passed. There was no point telling them not to, as they wouldn't listen to him, so he grabbed a few to join in, only he knew he probably would miss, because he didn't really want to throw pine cones at the train. "Here it comes," shouted Paul in excitement. The boys jumped up and down as they waited for the train to pass by. Michael went to the edge of the bridge and a little way down the side of the embankment. Paul went with him. John stayed at the top of the embankment. Although he wanted to get closer to the train, he didn't really want to attack it. John watched in awe as the train puffed towards them, steam and smoke gushing out, the distinctive chuff, 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 the sound of the wheels turning, bending to the will of the powerful engine. He waited for the smell. He knew it by heart. He stood transfixed. The train blew its whistle at the boys, and his brothers jumped up and down with glee, taking their best aim as the carriages passed by. Smack, smack, smack went the cones as they bounced off the windows. "What was that, Daddy?" said Ella, as she jumped in her seat. Another pine cone hit the window. Her father put a protective arm around her and peered out of the window over the top of his glasses. "Just some naughty kids," he said, tutting. "Someone should be watching them. They shouldn't be left to roam, making trouble." He had a good mind to report the children to the police. However, his thoughts were interrupted. "Ho, ho, ho," said Santa as he stepped into the first-class carriage. Not long after, a car came whizzing around the corner and over the bridge, scattering the boys. John dropped his unused pine cones. They collectively decided they'd better go home before their mum told them off for getting killed. Entering the housing estate, they walked the pavement as a posse, back to home, back to Mum. Old Mrs. Horrell stopped the boys as they passed her front garden. "Michael," she called, "Michael." Michael turned around and came to the gate. "Hello, Mrs. Horrell." "Michael, be a good boy and pass this to your mum, would you? I said I don't use it anymore, and she said she was thinking of doing something with her hair for Christmas." Michael gratefully received the pack of hair dye. "Thank you, Mrs. Horrell. That's really nice of you. I'll give it to Mum." "Good boy," she said, and she winked at Michael and Paul before ruffling John's hair and clopping back down the path with her stick. John wished he'd had a wink instead of having his hair ruffled. He styled it carefully with water every morning, just like his brothers, and he hated it when people messed it up. The boys walked down a side alley to the back of their mum's semi-detached house, or rather, not their mum's house, the council's house. It didn't really matter. It was where Mum was, and that meant home. Pulling their boots off on the back doorstep, they bashed their boots on the concrete to get rid of the worst of the mud before coming inside. Michael made them do it. He said Mum worked hard enough. John surveyed the back garden with discarded footballs and rusting bikes hidden in the uncut grass from the summer. It didn't really make sense to him, but Michael said he had to do it, so he did. Jenny was in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading a dog-eared magazine. "Oh, good," she said. "You're home. I'll start tea." "What have we got?" asked Paul. "Pasta cheese okay?" their mum replied. All the boys made yum sounds. They loved pasta cheese. Even though they had it a lot, it was always welcome. "Mrs. Horrell passed me this for you, Mum," said Michael, handing her the packet of hair dye. On the front of the packet were the words "Perfect Peach" in big curly letters. "Oh, fabulous," their mum said, looking pleased. "I've been wanting to do something to spruce up my appearance. I've really fancied pastel colours for a while. That's really nice of her." John watched his mum go into the hall mirror and puff and preen her hair. He was glad she was happy. She'd look really nice with some colours on her hair. "Have you had a good time out playing?" she shouted back through to the kitchen. "Yes," Michael replied, as he reached into the cupboard to get out a huge bottle of what proclaimed to be orange squash. Paul reached into a different cupboard for 3 beakers. John sat at the table, fiddling with a packet of dye, testing to see if the box might just open by accident so he could see what was inside. Michael passed a beaker of squash to him and took the packet of dye off him, placing it on the side of the worktop. Their mum came back into the kitchen to boil the pasta. As she passed by each boy, she gave them a little kiss on their heads. "Good boy," she said. "Mummy loves you." That night, John dreamt of trains. He was on the Santa Express steams train. It was a little like the Polar Express, but they'd lost the DVD, so he had to improvise in his dream to sort of recreate the story. It was somewhere between the local volunteer steam train and a massive locomotive heading for the North Pole. There were other children, just like him, playing on the train. Santa came into their carriage. "Ho, ho, ho," he said as he entered through the carriage door, several rows in front of John. He was a big old man with a round tummy and a red suit with white fur. In many ways he looked like the Fat Controller, not that John watched Thomas anymore, but John couldn't quite be sure if he had a bald head or not, due to the big red hat that covered it. "Ho, ho, ho," said Santa. John watched as Santa approached the first child 3 rows down. It was a little girl, about the same age as John. Santa knelt before her and said, "Ah, little Alice, what would you like for Christmas?" The girl replied like a rapid-fire shotgun with a list of toys John could only dream of. "I want a movie magic studio with the dolls. I want a tablet, but a big one so I can store more games. I want a Polly Pocket Rainbow Funland. I want princess dresses for my dressing-up box. I want a tent for my bedroom to play in. A new Barbie and Barbie van. A barking dog toy, like the one my friend Trish has. Some sweets and chocolates as well. Thank you, Santa." "Well," said Santa, chuckling a little, "that's a big list. You must have been a very good girl this year." "Yes," she replied confidently. Santa patted her on the head and moved a row forward. "Big list," thought John. That sounded like a whole toy shop. It sounded like more toys than he and his brothers had together. As he watched Santa talk to the 2 little boys 2 rows in front of him, it dawned on John in his dream that Santa might ask him what he'd like. He felt a bit strange at the thought. He'd always written letters to Santa. They all did at the start of December. But he knew that you didn't get all the things on your list. You only got a few. Santa was probably just being nice to the girl with the big list. He shook his head with experience. She'd be lucky to get a Polly Pocket. Suddenly, Santa was before him. He knelt down in front of him, smiling. John hadn't had time to think yet. "Ah, young John," said Santa. John reasoned that obviously Santa knew his name, as Santa knew everything, even if he'd been good or not. "Merry Christmas, sir," said John. Santa smiled. "And what would you like this Christmas?" John hadn't really had time to think, so he just blurted out the words as they formed in his head. "I really like trains, Santa. I like steam trains. I'd like to ride on a steam train or have a train set that's got batteries so it goes round on a track. But," he paused wisely, "I don't think Mum has much money this year, so I think it is better to ask for a turkey, because then we can all share it." He clarified, "I mean, me and my brothers and my mum, we all love having a roast, and it's really nice when we eat as a family." He nodded his head as the decision was made. "Yes, could I have a turkey for our Christmas lunch, please, Santa?" Santa knelt, very still, in front of the small boy. "Of course you can have a turkey for your Christmas lunch, my young friend." Santa placed his hand on John's head, but much to John's delight, he didn't ruffle his hair. In a soft voice he said, "You are a rather exceptional young man. You have a special place in the world. I hope you know that you are very lucky to have your mum and brothers who love you." John replied confidently, "I know, Santa. We love each other very much." Proudly he said, "We're a family." Santa nodded wisely. "Indeed you are." John felt a bit odd the next morning, thinking about the dream while brushing his teeth for school. Why did he ask for a turkey instead of a trip on the steam train? He decided that he'd write another letter to Santa during school today and post it on the way back home. He needed to clarify that it was a steam train trip he wanted. As it happened, it looked like turkey wasn't going to be available this Christmas anyway. The television on the news shouted out the news headlines while the brothers sat eating their oats before school. Our top news story: no turkey for Christmas. A recent outbreak of bird flu at 2 farms in Kent, who are both major suppliers for supermarket Christmas turkeys, mean that turkey is set to be a rarity for Christmas lunch this year. We now go live to our reporter at Mr. Matthews' farm in Appledore. "Mum," Michael shouted through to the kitchen. "Yes, love," came the reply. "No turkey this year. It's on the news." Jenny came through with her arms folded as she listened to the news article. She didn't know if she was relieved or disappointed. "Oh well, chicken it is then," she said as she tried to make light of it to the boys. "Time to get to school now." The boys finished their oats and put the bowls in the kitchen sink. Michael headed straight out to meet his friends and walk to the big school. Jenny helped John and Paul with their school things, and exiting the house, she carefully locked the door. Paul confided to John as they waved goodbye to their mum at the school gate, "I don't think we'd have turkey anyway, so don't be too disappointed." "Is it because of the electric?" John asked wisely. "Yeah, I think so. Also, Mum's boss is refusing to pay the overtime Mum did." He looked cautiously at his younger brother. "She might not be able to get us the presents we wanted this year." Paul softened the blow, but I overheard her say to Michael that she knew Santa was definitely coming with his presents because he always comes to the good kids, and we are such good boys. John nodded in affirmation. At home, he always wiped his feet and banged the mud off his boots, like Michael told him to. He brushed his own teeth and took his clothes down to the washing machine when they were dirty. He'd done his bit this year. Not that he believed in Santa, of course. That evening, Jenny motioned Paul upstairs to her bedroom, and closing the door, she sat him down on her bed. Taking his hand, she said, "Paul, you've always been very good to your brothers, but I need to ask you something, and this is completely your decision to make. Your father has sent £50 for your Christmas present this year. I'm having difficulty getting my boss to pay for the extra overtime I did to pay for your Christmas presents. Would it be okay with you if I spent this money on presents from Santa from all of you? I think John still believes in Santa. I'll try and get something from me to you all later in the year. What do you think?" Paul, just like Michael, was an old head on young shoulders. He reassuringly patted his mum's hand and said, "It's okay, Mum. I think the best thing to do is buy stocking presents for us all with the money. John said he doesn't believe in Santa anymore, but I secretly think he does, because he was talking about him in his sleep last night." A small tear escaped Jenny's eye at Paul's goodness, and she had a lump in her throat. She was a lucky mum to 3 wonderful boys. "I still have hope my boss will pay me. I have a few gifts on hold on Gumtree. Let's hope I don't have to do this, but I really appreciate your kindness if I do." She kissed the back of his hands and rubbed his shoulders as they left her bedroom, saying, "You're a good boy. You all are." Everyone at school was talking about the turkey shortage. That weekend, John brought it up with Michael. They were back at the bridge over the railway tracks, waiting for the steam train. "Michael, do you think we'll have turkey this year?" John asked. "Nah, I don't. I don't think many people are going to get turkey this year." Michael expertly threw a pine cone at the tracks to test his aim. "Oh," said John a little sadly. He knew the answer, really. It was just, after his dream with Santa, he'd hoped. Paul added, "But Michael's got a plan, haven't you, Michael?" "Yeah," Michael said. "I've been doing a few errands for Mrs. Horrell, and I've saved some money. I've enough for a frozen chicken and maybe some Christmas cake. I thought we'd surprise Mum on Christmas Eve so that she doesn't have to worry this Christmas." John smiled. He could taste the roast chicken already. Delicious. Just then, in the distance, they heard a whoop whoop. The boys jumped up and down in excitement, waiting for the train to pass by underneath. John and Paul met in the playground to discuss Michael's plans for Christmas and what they could do for Christmas presents for their mum. They couldn't buy anything, but they could do jobs around the house and they could make things. Paul had been working on a jewellery box. He'd found an old wooden box at the tip and he was gluing on little white stones that he'd stolen from a drive in the posh part of town. Michael had his plan of frozen chicken and Christmas cake. John decided he would draw a picture. He was quite good at art. He would draw a train. As they sat at the edge of the playground, one of the new girls came over. She joined in September and was in the class above John. She was from the posh part of town. "My dad said he's going to report you to the police." "What?" "What for?" Paul cockily said, putting his arm protectively around his brother and secretly wondering if it was for stealing white gravel stones. He didn't want to go to prison. "Throwing stones at the steam train." "They weren't stones. Anyway, it wasn't us." "Was," said Ella confidently. She looked them up and down. Then pulling her pink duck-down jacket a little tighter around her skinny body and flicking her blonde hair, she left to go back to playing with her friends. John was worried. "Do you really think they'll report us to the police? They might take us away from Mum." Somewhere in his mind there rose a fear that this had happened before, but he couldn't quite remember. Paul squeezed him a little tighter. "Don't worry about it. Mum and Michael dealt with that long ago. You're safe now." Jenny hadn't had the best of luck in love. Her husband, her first love, had died in a car accident when Michael was only 1. He left life insurance policies that covered the house. Although Jenny was financially secure, she was lonely. Next came her fiancé, the helicopter pilot. They were due to be married in the summer when Jenny fell pregnant in the spring. A month before the wedding, she found out that he was having an affair with his married co-worker. In pain and loss, Jenny scrabbled in the darkness to find love, and the dark found her. Her third partner, a businessman, charmed the birds from the trees. He was attentive to Michael and Paul, and he wanted marriage and kids, just like her, or so he told Jenny, until she fell pregnant. He gave her an ultimatum, him or the baby. When she chose the baby, he left. She thought for good, until a month after John was born, and the gates of hell opened on her. He wanted control. He wanted his property back. John. He had used her until she was useless. Then, when she failed to obey him, he dominated and abused her by what he believed would hurt her the most. He rained down legal letters on her, threatening to take John. It was nothing more than financial and legal rape. Jenny had to remortgage the house. When the judge ruled that he couldn't have sole custody, only supervised visits, he took matters into his own hands, and breaking into the house in the middle of the night, he attempted to abduct John. John was only 2. It was Michael that had caught him trying to strangle his mum in her bed. It was Michael who called and later testified to the police against a man he thought would become his father. It was Michael who helped keep his mum and the family safe. They moved to a safe house and eventually relocated far away from Jenny's family. They lost the house, but they were together. The businessman deemed that he had asserted his authority, taken everything of primary importance, money and security, and not wanting to risk his reputation for the sake of a child he had no interest in, he shrugged his shoulders at his suspended sentence and walked away. For now. Michael and his mum were always worried that one day he would come back. Michael sometimes confided in Paul, even though Paul didn't really remember much, apart from once having a house filled with lots of toys. John, of course, remembered nothing, and his family circled around him, protecting him and keeping it that way. John was safe, he was protected, and he was loved. Jenny vowed that never again would she trust a man. Her world was her boys, and she knew she was lucky they were all alive. On the morning of Christmas Eve, there was a loud knock at the door. The first smell of trouble was that it was the front door and not the back. Friends always came to the back. As per usual, Jenny looked out of the front window before answering the door. It was her boss. The boys stayed in the living room while she went through to the hall. They could hear raised voices. Michael stood up bravely and went through to the hall. Soon after, the door slammed and Michael escorted his mum, who was in tears, back through to the living room. "What's up, Mum?" asked John, distressed. "What's happened?" Michael looked angry and knitted his brows together. Mum's boss said he can't pay her this week due to complications working out her overtime. He's going to pay her after Christmas. The air in the room sank like lead as all of them felt the disappointment. They knew how their mum had been depending on some money to come through to get some last-minute Christmas essentials today. Michael sat on the sofa with his arm around his mum. Paul pulled John into the hall. "I know how to make this better. You go. I'll stay and try and sort this." "Go where?" asked John. "To the supermarket. Get a frozen chicken and a Christmas cake. I know where Michael's money is hidden. Come on." He motioned John upstairs. John felt pretty important on his quest. He was the one that was going to make it better. Santa had promised they would have a roast for Christmas lunch, and he felt he had Santa on his side, walking with him as he went to make good on that promise. The supermarket was already very busy. John had the money tucked tight in his pocket, and he kept touching it with his hand to make sure it was still there. Some of the Christmas displays were starting to look tattered and empty as the last of the shoppers made their final purchases. John tried not to gaze too long at all the good things to eat. He had an important job to do. He went over to the coal cabinet, which was almost completely empty. John stopped in shock for a moment. He hadn't seen it this bad before. Everyone had been panic buying meat before Christmas. There were a few chicken thighs, but no whole chickens or turkeys or any other type of bird. It was almost apocalyptic. In panic, he ran around the side of the aisle to the freezer cabinets, where the frozen birds were usually kept. His feet were like lead as he tried to move. In slow motion, he watched a man open the slider of the chest cabinet, reach down and remove the last frozen chicken in the supermarket. No, please, sir, I need that for my mum," John managed to squeak. The man turned around in surprise. John tried again. "Please, sir, it's for our Christmas lunch." John was starting to feel a little teary. "Please, sir, I need that for my mum," he said again. Just then, Ella from school came up and, pointing at John, said, "He's the one who threw the stones at the train, Dad." John watched the man's face morph red in contrast to his blonde hair, and with a voice as cold as ice, he said, "Well, unfortunately, we need this chicken for our Boxing Day lunch. You're lucky I didn't report you to the police. Now, scram." And scram John did. Hot tears flooding down his face. He ran out of the supermarket, along the road, past the fire station, and on into the paddocks behind the scrapyard. The back of his right hand was bleeding from where he had caught it on something. He didn't remember when. He sobbed heavily. His little chest heaved in and out. Hot, heavy tears plopped onto his polyester puffer coat. The world was so unfair. Ian Gently and his daughter Ella left the supermarket. Ian was cross. He dragged Ella along as he stomped his way to the car, muttering under his breath, "Need to learn a lesson. Hard school of life. Time to grow up and learn what life is about. I had it tough." Only Ian hadn't had it tough growing up, comparatively. Ian was so engrossed with his justifications of his poor behaviour that he didn't see the cardboard box someone had left in the car park. He went flying. The shopping bags spilled over. The frozen chicken rolled out. "Oh, Dad!" Ella cried and rushed to help her father. She inspected his grazed hands and retrieved his glasses. The arm on one side was a little wonky. "I'm fine, love, I'm fine." Ian picked up the shopping and placed the small frozen chicken back in the bag. It was cold and heavy. Ian was glad to get home after that. He wasn't feeling very good at all. When John had stopped crying, he dragged his feet slowly home, Michael's hard-earned money burning a hole in his pocket. John told his mum and brothers what had happened. When he got to the last frozen chicken, he started crying all over again. John's mum and brothers hugged him and wiped away the tears. They told him not to worry. John felt like it couldn't get much worse. Bravely, Michael said, "To be honest, I've always thought that Tim's span with gravy tastes just as nice as chicken." 3 sets of sad eyes turned to Michael with hope. Michael put his arm around John and said, "Let's go back to the supermarket together and see what we can find, eh?" John was proud to have a brother like Michael. As they went through to the hall and Michael pulled his coat off the coat hook, he caught the hall mirror. Coming off its hook, it deftly slid along the wall and landed heavily on the protruding plug socket below before shattering into a million pieces. No one wanted to say it. They all knew the saying, 7 years bad luck. Mustering confidence and strength he didn't know he had, Michael turned to his mum. "Sorry, Mum." Everyone was a little shaken and fractured by the tough time they'd had lately. Jenny turned to her son with nothing but love. Kissing him on the top of his head, she said, "It's just a mirror. Things can get fixed. Thank God it wasn't one of you." Paul grabbed the dustpan and brush from the kitchen. Michael held John back as they tidied the glass off the floor. The plug socket had cracked too. "I'll pop by the hardware store, Mum," said Michael with a confidence that they all clung on to. "You never know what might be in the reduced section." His mum hugged him, then topped up the zip on John's coat. "Lucky things always seem to happen at the right time. Have a look. You never know," she said. The boys grouped hugged Jenny. Whatever life threw at them, they would get through it as a family. Ian gently and his daughter Ella walked along the pavement of the housing estate. The frozen chicken was a heavy weight in the plastic bag that he held. Santa and his reindeer had attacked most of the houses on the estate, and in some places each other, as plastic recreations of them hung from roofs or lay fallen in gardens. Ian watched an old lady try to right her garden Santa's sleigh as she balanced precariously on her stick. He counted along the numbers as the old lady turned to watch him walk by. Number 59. This was it. Ian purposefully pushed back the garden gate as paint flaked off in his hands and the cold steel bit back at him. The concrete path was cracked and the grass lay still and long, with frost forming on it as the afternoon air started to chill. Little icicle lights ran around the guttering, and he could see a Christmas tree with dancing multicoloured lights and baubles peeking out from the front living room window. Ian knocked on the door. He had the strangest feeling of being watched and turned to see the old lady he'd passed 2 doors back, leaning on her wall, watching them. He felt like a stage actor at the theatre, and she was waiting to be amused. Ella tugged at her dad's hand. "Daddy," she whispered to him. "Shh," he said, as he squeezed her little hand a little tighter. The door opened. There, in the warm glow of the hall light, stood a woman surrounded by 3 young boys. She had porcelain white skin, striking hazel eyes, rimmed red, probably from alcohol, and the most extraordinary orange hair. In her hand she held a screwdriver, and behind her he could see the remnants of a plug socket on the floor. He said, trying to take it all in. The youngest boy, the boy from the supermarket that morning, was looking at him with horror and fear. Ian continued, "I think there was a mistake about a chicken this morning," he said, offering her the heavy plastic bag in his hand. Her look cooled. Ian scrabbled to fill the silence. "You know, you really ought to be careful with that," he said, gesturing to the plug socket. "Do you want me to look for you?" Her look hardened as she replied in an even voice. "No, thank you. I know how to isolate the sockets. They're on a different circuit to the main lights." She used the screwdriver in her hand to prod upwards in the direction of the hall light above her. "I don't need your help." Then she looked angrily and put her arm around John. "John told me about your behaviour regarding the chicken this morning." Then she swore at him and slammed the door in his face. Ella jerked Ian's arm as she jumped backwards. From a little distance away, Ian could hear someone laughing. Ha, 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 ho, ho, ho. Ian turned to see the old lady he'd passed earlier, nearly bent over with laughter. "I'm sorry," he said. "What has this got to do with you?" The old lady continued to laugh as she said, "Seems like she doesn't need your type of charity, doesn't it? Perhaps it's time to take your patronising charity back to where it came from." And the old lady swore at him too. And turning on her heel, she and her stick clopped back into her little house, while her body still wobbled with laughter at the man. Ian's day had gone from bad to worse. He'd already felt like rubbish after the incident with the frozen chicken. He'd tried to make it right. And all that had happened was he'd been sworn at, almost like he was in the wrong. Ian was distracted through the carol service. He was distant over dinner with Ella. He spent the night tossing and turning, dreaming of frozen chickens falling on his head. In all of his dreams, he was in the wrong. He had done something wrong. Ian woke suddenly in the middle of the night, sweating and twisted in his sheets. He exclaimed to the darkness, "I know what to do. I have a plan." The darkness returned silence back to him. Ian rolled over and fell back to sleep. John snuggled up to his mum as she opened the large homemade envelope that contained his Christmas present to her. He watched her undo the ribbon at the side to reveal a picture of a steam train. He'd drawn it all himself. He'd coloured it carefully, blue, of course. He'd drawn the driver in to look a little bit like himself. He'd even attempted the steam and smoke coming out of the steam engine in the right places. "Oh, John," his mum exclaimed. "Oh, John, this is beautiful." She held the picture up admiringly. "I think it's the best picture you have ever drawn. It's stunning, my love." Michael and Paul crowded onto the sofa to look at the picture too, as Jenny held it up so they could all see. Then she kissed John on the top of his head. Slowly standing up, she said, "I know just what to do with this." She went over to the wall above the telly and, reaching towards one of the clip frames, reached up, removed her college certificate from the frame and replaced it with John's picture. She then proudly replaced the clip frame with the train picture back on the wall. Turning back to John, she said, "It's a beautiful picture. Thank you." All the boys looked pleased. There was a knock at the front door. Internally, they all groaned. Jenny went to the window and peered out. Then, circling back round to the hall, she said, "It's the little girl from yesterday." Opening the door, Ella stood in the doorway alone. "Please, miss," she said, "my dad's hurt and the ambulance can't come for 2 hours. Can you help me?" She had practised her lines several times. There was a Polly Pocket Rainbow Funland riding on this. Jenny looked at the little girl. In her she saw herself. How often had she been scared or unsure or needed help? "Of course I can, sweetheart," she said kindly. "Boys," she shouted behind her, "we need to pop out a minute. Michael, can you turn the oven off and lock the back door? Quickly, please." Paul and John grabbed their coats and wellies. Michael disappeared into the back of the house. Ella looked up at the lady as she stepped outside. "You'll need your coat, miss." "It's okay," Jenny said, placing her hand on the girl's shoulder. "I don't feel the cold." She turned to lock the front door behind them all. John put his cold hand inside his mum's warm one, and she gave it a reassuring squeeze as they rushed off along the pavement together. Ella's house was very large. John had seen large houses before, but he couldn't remember being allowed up the driveway of one. The garden was neat and tidy. Little grey gravel stones crunched under his feet. He felt worried, but his mum seemed confident despite her hand being ice cold. As they entered the house, they quickly removed their shoes and boots. Jenny asked Ella, "Where is he?" "Through here," Ella pointed sheepishly. Jenny rushed through to the kitchen to see Ian gently, perfectly healthy, basting the most enormous turkey as the heat of the oven puffed turkey scents and warmth around the cold, hungry family. John stood behind his mum, observing what seemed to be something akin to Christmas lunch heaven. His tummy grumbled and his mouth watered at the sights and smells before him, despite it being the mean man hovering over the turkey. Even Michael didn't have any brave or wise words to say, as all 3 boys stood staring and speechless. I hoped you would share our Christmas lunch with us, Ian said in his nicest, kindest voice. Before anyone could answer, John tugged his mum's hand, and with eyes as wide as saucers, he said, "Oh, can we, Mum? Can we?" He didn't think he'd smelt something so delicious for practically the whole of his life. There was also a small awareness, somewhere in John's heart, that the man was trying to say sorry for being so mean. All of Jenny's boys turned to her with hope. Jenny was proud, but she wasn't prideful. She knew what this meant to them, and if it meant she had to be a little humble for an hour or two, then she would. "That's very kind of you," she answered slowly. "Thank you very much. We'd love to join you." Everybody relaxed. The boys let out a little cheer and allowed themselves to audibly sniff the air and say yum. Ian beamed with pleasure. Ella stood back a little, watching and trying to work out what was going on. She knew her dad had done something wrong and that he was trying to make it right. Her job was to be a polite hostess, as he'd instructed her. Ian continued. "Lunch should be ready in about 40 minutes, he said. Perhaps you'd like to watch a movie together while I finish preparing it." John couldn't believe how his Christmas was panning out. He didn't exactly like or trust the man, but he had turkey and... "Can we watch the Polar Express, please?" he asked with excitement. Ian turned to John with raised eyebrows. "So you like trains, do you?" "More than anything in the world," John exclaimed, then quickly added, "except Mum," loyally holding her hand. Ian carefully closed the oven door behind the turkey and gave his full attention to the young boy. "I do too," he said simply. In that moment, man and boy connected in a kindred love of trains. "I have a Hornby train set I've been working on in the attic. Do you want to see it?" John could not possibly believe the day could get any better. He turned to his mum. "Well," she said, thinking they knew very little about this man, and what they did know hadn't been overwhelmingly favourable so far. John begged her, "Please, Mum, please, please." Jenny caved. "Very well. We are just here if you need anything." She turned to Ian, carefully watching him. "Do you want me to help with the lunch preparations?" "Yes," Ian said graciously. "Thank you." Ella wasn't that fond of trains, but she knew she had to be a good hostess. Her dad had told her so. Besides, she knew Paul and John from school, so she suggested showing them round, then starting the DVD ready for when her dad and John came back down from the attic. Jenny donned a spare apron as her children scattered. Ian led the way to the attic. The sight that met John was something he could never have dreamt of. Over the entirety of the attic space of the house was a large MDF table with walking space around the edge. On it, part constructed, was the most extensive train set he had ever seen. Little stacks of tracks lay in bundles in various places waiting to be placed. Some of the trains and trailers had been arranged side by side, ready to go, almost as if they were surrounded by an invisible shed. There were some stations and people, farms and trees, all in the process of being unpacked. "Oh, wow," said John, impressed. He never knew that anything like this existed. The man must be very, very rich. He cautiously went over to one of the trains and peered down to look at it. "You can pick it up if you like," Ian said graciously. As if he was holding a delicate porcelain cup, John gently picked up the train and studied it. He knew all the components and names of the different parts of the train by heart. He'd read books from the library. He knew the famous trains like the Mallard, City of Truro, Stephenson's Rocket, and the Flying Scotsman. Ian spied one of his unused Hornby train sets in the corner. It was a Christmas novelty set, although of Hornby quality. It had a fluorescent yellow label with £90 crossed out and £45 written over it. He picked it up from a car boot sale last summer. Unobserved, he picked off the label while John admired the trains on display. Then, dusting the box with his hands, he offered it to John. It was quite possibly the best present John had ever received. All he could keep saying was, "Wow," and "Thank you." Ian felt wonderful, not only because John was happy and he'd done something nice for him rather than making him cry, but also because he could see in John the niche enthusiasm for trains that Ian had had his whole life. When Ian and John returned downstairs, they found Ella, Paul and Michael happily snuggled up in the TV room watching Christmas films, and Jenny in the kitchen where she'd nearly finished serving up lunch. John knew his mum wouldn't grumble being left to sort lunch. She never did. She often said it made her happy to do things for other people. He also knew that everyone was looking forward to the turkey. Lunch was delicious and it was happy. Everyone relaxed and unwound. Ella found she quite liked having other people to talk to. Jenny was happy that her boys were happy. Ian was glad to have finally found a way to be acceptably kind and not condescending. And John felt as if this was the best day of his life and he never wanted it to end. As they tidied up after lunch and John's mum started to make comments about getting back, John tried to delay things a little. "Mum, Mr. Gently said he has a piano. Didn't you used to play the piano, Mum?" Ian looked at Jenny and her strange orange hair in surprise. He offered, "You are more than welcome to play. It was my mother's, but neither of us play. I still keep it tuned, though." John thought it was strange to have a piano when you didn't play it, but he kept his thoughts to himself as his mum allowed herself to be led through to the formal sitting room. John watched her tentatively run her hands along the wood of the baby grand. He watched her slowly sit down and stretch out her bony, hard-working fingers. John had never heard his mum play, but Michael sometimes mentioned it. As Jenny's hands stretched in recognition, she started playing. It was completely different, like nothing John had ever heard before. He stood there, clutching his train set box, watching his mum. John was not the only person transfixed by his mum's talent. Ian, similarly, stood transfixed by this remarkable woman. Paul and Michael crowded around her. Ella wished she could be her. When she finished, Jenny smiled contentedly. She loved her piano. Yes, she'd miss this, but obviously her boys were so much more important. One day she'd pick up a second-hand piano. One day. John broke the silence. "What was that, Mum? What was that music?" She turned and smiled to him. "The heart asks pleasure first. It's by Michael Nyman, one of my favourites." "Well," she said, closing the lid on the piano, "time to go." At the front door, as they were putting on their boots, John watched Ian give Jenny his mobile number. John was really glad. It meant he could come back and see the trains. The family walked back home in the cooling afternoon with many mixed emotions. John asked, "Mum, are we going to see him again?" Jenny squeezed his hand a little tighter. "We've had such a lovely day, haven't we? But, my love, you can never trust a man completely. One act of kindness, or even 2 or 3 acts of kindness, doesn't a kind man make. It takes time to learn someone's true character, and you are all too important to me to risk anyone hurting any of you ever again." John had a feeling that probably he shouldn't talk about the subject again, so he just hugged his train a little tighter, realising, as he did so, that all of the things he'd asked from Santa, apart from the ride on the steam train, had come true. In the spring came John's birthday, and with it a few more freedoms. He was allowed to go to the library by himself if he said what time he was coming back by, and now that his mum had a new job, she set all the boys little errands and jobs to do each week to allow them to earn a little pocket money for sweets. John was allowed to go to the sweet shop alone too. The sweet shop was on the same street as the old train station. John would always add 10 minutes to his allotted time on a Saturday morning, so he had time to peer in each of the gates around the station and see which of the steam locomotives the volunteer engineers were working on this week. On Sundays, they would allow visitors onto the trains, and they would run the steam engines up and down the restored track to the nearest town. John pressed his face to the steel bars of the main gateway into the engineering yard. There was a yellow crane lifting blue sacks from the ground onto a railway trailer. Several men in orange suits hung around talking or directing or watching. John wondered what they were doing. One of the men turned around and John instinctively recognised Mr. Gently. He waved and Ian waved back and came over. "Hello, John," he said, and recognising the same glint in the young boy's eye that was in his own, he offered, "Do you want to come in?" Yes, please. And forgetting all about being back in 20 minutes, he followed Ian gently into the yard. Where's Ella? John asked, looking around. Oh, she's with her mum, Ian replied. John knew about these things, except that he didn't see his dad. He knew that he'd been to prison for trying to hurt them all, or something like that. John shuddered at the thought. They were quite happy, just as they were. Ian showed John around and explained about the different parts of the trains. One of the steam trains was being fired up. We're going to give this one a run out before the visitors come tomorrow. Would you like to come? John didn't hesitate. Of course it was a yes. He didn't even consider his mum. Ian gently helped John up into the cab of the train. The driver smiled kindly at John as he directed John where to stand. Holding on, as instructed, John watched the men get to work, opening the furnace and loading it with coal, playing with the levers and working with their colleagues to get the clearance to leave the station. Then they were off. The engine sounded like a huge rumbling dragon with steam snorting out. Slowly they built speed as the massive engine moved out of the station, gathering pace, under the bridge where John had stood watching so many times, past the signals, out into the countryside. It felt like they were flying along. The distinctive smoke and steam smell from the engine filled John's nostrils. The men monitored the dials and levers. They were covered in dirt and grease, but they didn't care. John clutched his sweets, his eyes wide open, and his heart thumping in time with the engine. It was wonderful. It was only when they got back to the station again, an hour later, that John remembered his promise to his mum. Ian told him not to worry and gave John's mum a call on his mobile. John could hear a heated discussion over the phone. Mr. Gently then hung up and said, Look, I'd better walk you back home. Is that okay? Am I in trouble? John asked. Nope, I think I'm in trouble, said Ian, and sighed a little bit. As they walked along the pavement, Ian in his dirty orange boiler suit and John clutching his sweets, John wondered what his mum would say. He definitely wouldn't be allowed to go on the train again. He was gutted. They passed by Mrs. Horrell's garden, and she hobbled out on her stick. Hello, Mrs. Horrell, John called. Hello, she waved back. Good morning, Ian offered, wondering what she was coming out to see this time. Almost as if she'd read his mind, she quipped, just positioning myself ready for the morning's entertainment. And winking again at John, he preferred the winks to the hair ruffles. She leant her elbows on the garden wall and watched them up the path to the front door of number 59. John's mum looked a little out of sorts and asked Ian inside. John, you go and sit in the living room while I talk to Mr. Gently, as she instructed. I also think you owe your brothers an apology, as they have been out looking for you this morning. John felt pretty bad. He had been so excited about the train, he just hadn't thought about it. He apologised to his brothers, and to make up for it, he offered to share his sweets. All three boys sat on the sofa, in the quiet, sucking gobstoppers, trying to hear what their mum was saying in the kitchen. After what seemed like quite a long time, their mum came out and into the living room with Ian. John, she said as she knelt in front of him, I know you love trains, but what you did today was really, really dangerous. Mummy was worried somebody had taken you. Paul and Michael exchanged looks over John's head. Jenny continued, It is okay to sometimes go and play at Mr. Gently's house with his trains and to go on the steam train with him, but it needs to be pre-arranged and you have to promise to stick to the times we have agreed. Does that sound okay? John was so happy. He thought he was going to get grounded. He thought he would never get to go on a steam train again. Instead, he was going to be able to play with Mr. Gently's train set and he would get to go on the steam trains. John was happy to agree to any terms under those circumstances. John watched his mum escort Mr. Gently to the front door. At the doorstep, Ian smiled at Jenny and said, Thank you. I'm glad you understand. I know how he feels, as I was exactly the same at his age. Jenny replied, I'm just glad he's safe and happy. That's all that matters. As Ian walked back down the pavement, out of the housing estate, he still had a silly smile on his face until Mrs. Horrell called out to him, Ah, the lovely Jenny, well worth the courting, but if you're going to have to put in a bit more effort than that. And chuckling, she wobbled off back to indoors, her black walking stick clopping along the path beside her. It was Christmas Eve, and many things had changed since last Christmas. The first change was that their mum had got a better job. Her boss was nice, and she was able to buy presents and put them under the tree before Christmas, so the boys knew that there were Christmas presents and they were going to get something this year. Also, they didn't have to worry about the turkey, as they were going to eat with Mr. Gently and Ella again, and John knew for a fact that Mr. Gently had a turkey, as he had shown John when he went over to play with the Horby train sets on Wednesday afternoon. Every Wednesday, John went to Mr. Gently's house to play trains, and every Saturday morning he was allowed to visit the train yard, and if the steam train was out on the Saturday, John was quite often allowed to go in the cab with the driver for a ride out. John's knowledge of trains had increased rapidly, and he loved to get train books from the library. He was ever hungry to learn more. Mr. Gently had even recommended a few books, and John had been able to make a library request for them. John had had a wonderful year. When it came to writing a letter to Santa at the start of December, John didn't know what to put, as he already had everything he wanted. Some of the kids in his school year said Santa didn't exist, but John knew better. He'd got everything that he'd asked for. It was strange that he'd once been so upset and scared by Mr. Gently, whereas now he couldn't imagine not having this kind, interesting man around. Mr. Gently knew so much about trains. John was also aware that his mum wasn't angry at Mr. Gently anymore, which was a relief. John hadn't said anything to his brothers because they'd been out at the time, but one Saturday, a couple of weeks ago, when Mr. Gently had walked John back home, something had happened. Mr. Gently had taken his boots off at the back door to have a cup of tea with John's mum. John had gone upstairs to add some track that Mr. Gently had given him to his Polar Express, as John liked to call his Hornby Christmas train. When John had come back down to the kitchen, he'd seen his mum pass Mr. Gently his tea, and he'd watched Mr. Gently put it down on the kitchen work surface. Then he'd reached forward, and taking John's mum's hand, he pulled her towards him and kissed her. John thought his mum was going to be angry, but she wasn't. John felt a bit awkward watching, so he quietly went back upstairs to play with his train. Anyway, John reasoned, if his mum and Mr. Gently did get married, then he could play with Mr. Gently's trains all the time. Besides, Ella already called him and Paul her brothers at school. Paul had even sorted out one of the girls that had been bullying her in her class. They were pretty much a family anyway, and families were always better, bigger. John and his brothers went to sleep that Christmas Eve, imagining what surprises Christmas Day might bring this year. They all had a good feeling about it. Michael imagined what it would be like not to have to be responsible all the time, and what it might be like to feel safe and protected again. Paul liked being a big brother. He admired Michael and wanted to be just like him. He liked it when Ella asked for his help and called him her big brother, just as John did. John imagined being on a steam train. It was the Polar Express. The train jostled and jiggled as it left the station. The little girl next to him, who looked a little like Ella but not quite, said that Santa was going to be on board, and had he thought of what he was going to ask Santa for? John drifted off to sleep.